What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. I am so excited for today's video because in today's video, I'm going to share with you some of the worst places to plant certain plants. Now, we talked last year about how there are what's called smart plantings, and this brought up a lot of questions in the comments box about kind of examples of not so smart plantings, and so I thought, let's talk about that. So I think a lot of you have heard with things like tomatoes. We just planted our tomatoes in the ground. Love it. Great time of year when tomatoes go in the ground. But a lot of you guys know that you can plant things like basil next to tomatoes without much of an issue. You can plant, we talked about in another video, how to intercrop tomatoes, which we're going to be doing another follow-up video on intercropping. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that video. But we talked about how we intercrop beans around tomatoes as well, bush beans. And we talked about how there's a lot of different plants that you can intercrop within your garden so that you not only maximize your space, you grow more food in less space, but you're also maybe sometimes getting a benefit from those plants in the garden. And so in this video, I'm going to talk about the opposite. I'm going to talk about the plants that you want to kind of be careful of planting in certain parts of your garden because they can actually cause some issues. So with that being said, let's get on into today's video and start right out with the very first one, which is planting what I would consider to be invasive or aggressive space hogging plants in your garden rather than containers. So if you plant things like mint, or this is oregano, mint, oregano, chives, these can be very, very aggressive. They can take over your garden and, well, they can look like this. This mess is oregano. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, Luke, how is this a mess? This looks absolutely beautiful. Well, it is beautiful, but only if you need like 10 pounds of oregano, because the thing is that this has gone to seed, and now I have oregano literally growing in every part of our garden. We have oregano in our walkways. We have oregano in our grass. We have oregano pretty much just about everywhere, and it's because we planted it in our garden and not in a container. And that's because had I known that that this was a very aggressive growing plant, a plant that grew along the ground and set down roots all along the way, I would have been careful not to plant this in this bed, or I would have been very careful to to manage it and regulate it so it didn't get out of control. And so this is just a poor example, or not a poor, it's a very good example of a poor planting, not smart at all, because it's just going to take over, and I'm actually going to end up probably taking out about half of this plant this year, dividing it up and giving it away to friends and family with the advice of planting it in a container, of course. All right, now the second plant that is not a great planting in the garden are things that are small next to things that are tall, like this. Like this is our lettuce here and our radishes. These are low-growing plants. These are small plants, and they really would stand no chance against a tall plant like a pumpkin, or a tall plant like it might be I don't know, a tall plant like a pepper plant or something like that. Something that gets very tall and shades the plants out. You're really gonna have a hard time with these competing, and because at the end of the day, they need sunlight just like everything else. And so because these plants here are such a small plant, they would be easily smothered by a pumpkin. They'd be easily kind of trampled, well, they'd be trampled by a pumpkin. They'd be smothered by things like a tomato or a pepper. Now, if you were to grow the tomato plant up, if you were to actually trellis the tomato plant up and prune it, that's a different story, and there are some exceptions, but for the most part, another example would be things like corn. Corn's a great example of a plant that gets 6-7 feet tall, sometimes taller. And if you plant corn, it's going to shade everything out. It's going to take so much space, and you're really going to smother these smaller plants here. That's a prime example of a poor planting. Now, I know a lot of you are going to wonder, well, okay, so lettuce and radishes is one example. Well, what about things like beans? Can you plant beans next to things like corn? You talked about planting beans next to things like tomatoes. Yeah, bush beans are a small, low-growing plant. But like I said, there are some exceptions to how you grow, but I would never, ever plant bush beans next to corn. And I know a lot of people are going to say, well, what about Three Sisters, the Three Sisters garden? That's using pole beans. So the pole beans actually grow up the corn stalks and use them as support. It's a lot different than planting, a row of beans and a row of corn and a row of beans and a row of corn, because the corn, when it gets fully mature, it's going to absolutely just, it's going to smother out all those plants when it gets fully mature, because you have to plant corn in a block. The corn has to be planted in a block so that it pollinates better and you get better fruit set, or better, fruit set. And those corn cobs need good pollination, and so you have to plant a lot of them, and you're just not going to get really good success by planting them just next to smaller plants like this. Keep tall plants separate from small plants, and the separation will really help you out. Now, another example of a not so smart planting are trees next to houses. Now, it doesn't matter if it's an edible or an ornamental, trees next to houses are a bad thing, and that's because trees have very, very strong roots. And a lot of people buy houses and find that the foundation actually has roots that have worked their way in between the bricks. And as those roots expand, they actually can break brick or move brick. And that's why trees next to sidewalks can oftentimes heave up the pavers. They can oftentimes crack your driveway. Roots are extremely powerful, and you never want to doubt the power of a root. And so typically, they say if you're planting a tree that is a dwarf, you want to keep that dwarf tree. A dwarf is anything under 10 feet that's maxed out, won't grow any taller. You want to keep those trees at least 6 feet away, at least 6 feet away, if not further, away from your house. With things that will grow, just keep growing until they pretty much reach their biological potential and they stop growing. It could be 40, 50 feet tall. You want to keep those at least 25 feet away from your house. Now, that seems like a long way, and a lot of people want to plant very close to their home for privacy or for a windbreak, for shade, or it even helps lower their heating bill because it shades their house. So it actually can be a money saver and an energy saver. But the reality is that you can still have some of those benefits just by picking different trees and planting those smaller trees closer to the home, keeping the bigger trees further away, because that is not smart at all. It's a very easy way to not only ruin your home, but decrease its value and cause a lot of damage in the long run. So big trees, keep them away from the home. Now, the next example of a not so smart planting is by planting perennials in an area where you have to move them or you don't want them to be long term. Now, perennials, as the name implies, are perennial. They come back year after year, every year, assuming you're in the right growing zone. They will come back. And the problem with a lot of people is they'll plant something and they'll say, I really don't like it there, and move it. Well, you can't move a perennial, because once it gets established, you can move a perennial, but not without really stressing it out, if not sometimes killing it. And so in the case of things like asparagus or this beautiful lavender here, once it's planted, you want to pick its home and you want to leave it there for the rest of its life. And so, we will plant around this lavender rather than dig it up. It becomes a part of the garden layout, and you just kind of work around it. Perennial herbs, thyme, oregano, definitely another perennials. Why? Recommend for many reasons that you don't plant oregano in the raised bed or in your in-ground garden. I'm only warning you. But if you don't take that warning, see what happens. So you just want to be careful that you kind of have that foresight. Really think about what that perennial is going to look like in 5 years. Is your garden still going to be there in 5 years? Is it going to need to be changed or moved? Does it not fit in with your overall plan? And it's okay to make those decisions later on and say, it's just not really working out there. But I think to just plant a perennial there without having any foresight at all and really looking at that can be a common mistake that a lot of people make. And perennials are something that they can be such an asset in the garden because of the fact that they come back year after year. You don't have to grow them again. You literally plant them and they just get established and they keep growing back. So rhubarb, lavender, a lot of your herbs, strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, fruit trees, and even flowers. There's lots of perennial flowers as well. Lilies and tulips, daffodils. There's so many different perennials. And I like to just say, mark out that spot, look at your garden plan, see if it's going to conflict with anything in a future garden plan. And if it does, work it around before you plant it in the ground, because once you get it established, it's best just to leave it there. All right, and the final not so smart planting is by planting plants that don't have the same growing environment. These can be things that their soil to be a certain way, things like carrots versus broccoli. So carrots like very loose soil, very well-draining soil that they can go down through and form a very uniform taproot. Broccoli, on the other hand, As we've talked about in our growing guide, if you haven't seen it, check it out. It'll really help you out. Broccoli likes compacted soil. It actually likes soil that's a little bit on the compacted side. That helps cut down on things like root knot nematode. And so you compact the soil, you compress the soil a little bit so that it actually will help the broccoli grow better. And so common knowledge would say don't plant carrots next to things like broccoli because you're going to have an issue with the two soil types. They don't like those two soil conditions. Looking at things like herbs, you have Mediterranean herbs. These grow in very arid, dry climates. They don't like lots of water at all. So don't plant them next to things that like lots of water. Don't plant them next to plants like cilantro that need lots of water. Don't plant them next to things that are going to require regular watering, because these plants, they will actually suffer a lot of root rot. They'll start to yellow, they'll start to drop their leaves, and you'll really suffer. But you'll notice these plants are absolutely beautiful, and we planted them with other plants like sage, like oregano, which I don't recommend planting in the garden, but we had some oregano planted around. Basil would be another one to plant here. Those are all your Mediterranean kind of style plants where they're all growing in a similar environment. Your tomatoes, similar thing. They like to be dry every once in a while. They don't like to be wet all the time. Peppers, very similar conditions. They don't like to be wet all the time. So I would plant those. Those are all really good plants to kind of plant together, but don't put plants that require lots of water next to plants that like their climate a little drier, because you're going to have some issues. Those are not smart to do that, because one plant, there's always going to be one person that wins and one person that loses in that situation. So the other thing too, is a not so smart planting that kind of ties into this is it a warm weather crop or a cool weather crop? So if I'm going to grow something that's a warm weather crop, common sense would say that a not so smart planting is planting a tomato in very early spring. It's just not smart in general to plant in that time of year, and so it could be a seasonal thing as well. Environmental and seasonal kind of all tying in. So those are the not so smart plantings. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. If you did, make sure to throw a like up there. It really would help spread this video around, and YouTube likes to see that engagement from you, the viewer, checking out our videos. And plus, a thumbs up means that I taught you something, you benefited from this video, even if it was just entertainment. Even if it was just entertainment, throw a like up there because you benefited in some way. And I would really appreciate that. So thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you so much for subscribing. Hope you guys are growing bigger, going home. And we'll catch you all on the next episode. See you guys. Bye.